that diaphragm going, it's like you're jumping on a trampoline, right? Like, we don't, it's a little fast. Get the blood moving, except for the blood doesn't want to move because of the biscuits and gravy. Turn in your Bibles this morning to Daniel chapter 5. That's where we're going to be this morning. So it's been a little while since I've been to the doctor. I have to go every 6 months for a med checkup and things like that. But anybody here actually like going to the doctor? I didn't think I'd see any hands. But, you know, I know some of you have already been through this, but I'm at the age where, like, things are really starting to rapidly fall apart. Like it's starting to speed up a lot. So I go to the eye doctor and he's like, yeah, you're probably going to be in bifocals pretty soon. And, it's things like that. And the last time I got my height and weight checked, the lady was like, okay, you're 5'7" and a half. And I'm like, no, you need to check that again. I'm 5'8", and I need every inch. Like, you don't understand. I need that half inch. It's really important. And she's like, no, you're getting to the age where you're going to start shrinking. And I'm like, ooh, that's not good. That is not good. And they have you step on the scale, and never in my life have they ever said, you're getting a little too light here. Like, the weight's real. Like, you're not weighing what you ought to weigh. That is not the problem I have ever had. And I don't know how many people really do experience that. Like, anybody over the age of like 30 ever go to the doctor and have the doctor be like, boy, you need to start putting on some LBs here? Or like, that's probably not happening to most people. Most people, you go to the doctor and like, yeah, you might be able to, you could lose 2 or 3 pounds at least. For me, it might be 2 or 3 times 50 or whatever it might be. But I thought about that, and because in the passage today, we're going to see a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, who we've been looking at throughout Daniel, the book of Daniel. We're going to see one of his descendants making some mistakes. And as he is placed on the scale, it actually turns out that he is coming up a little light. He is coming up a little bit short. So short, in fact, that some bad things are going to happen in the very near future for him. But if you want to turn in your Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 5, we're going to continue our series called Dominion. And we're looking at Daniel and the sovereignty of God. We're asking the question every single week. We're asking the question throughout the book, who is really in charge? Who is really the one in charge of not only this nation that is represented here, but all the nations represented in this story, but who is really in charge of this world? Who reigns supreme as God alone? Because a lot of people don't seem to understand who that is in this book. And I think that today there's a lot of people who don't understand who's really in charge. So we're going to continue to ask that question. We're going to continue to dive in. So if you have your Bibles, starting in verse 1, chapter 5, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. And the king watched the hand as it wrote. And his face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. And the king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners, and he said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck. He'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And then the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. And the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed, and don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what that writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father and the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel answered the king, You keep your gifts for yourself. You give your rewards to somebody else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those the king wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. We saw that last week. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal, and he lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched in the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see, hear, or understand. But you did not honor God, the God who holds in his hands your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided, and it's given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed to be the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And what I find very interesting in this passage is how the family dynamics all play out. And it shows that what we prioritize is going to influence what the next generation pursues. This story is as much about how we pass down what we believe and what we value to our kids, our grandchildren, and those who come after. What we set as the priority is what our children will prioritize and what they will pursue. And the question that I have then is, what are the next generations picking up from the patterns of life that they see in us? What are they thinking is important when they look at you, when they look at me, when our children and our grandchildren look at us and they observe our way of life? Not just hear the words that come out of our mouth, but when they look at how we live and what we pursue and what we prioritize, what are they going to prioritize? What are they seeing? Some of you know this, and I'm not, I confess, I'm not much of a country fan, but I know that there are some, and so I thought about this Hank Williams song. Some of you know that Hank Williams Jr., he had a hit in the 70s titled Family Tradition. How many of you know this song? Family Tradition. And so I went and I listened to that song. And he explains away his poor choices in this song, his poor choices in life as a continuation of a family tradition. That's what he does. He sings, "So don't ask me, Hank, why do you drink? Why do you roll smoke? Why must you live out the songs that you wrote? Stop and think it over. Put yourselves in my position. If I get stoned and drink all night, it's just a family tradition. It's just what we do as a family." And what's truly sad about this declaration is that if you know anything about Hank Williams Jr. and you know about his upbringing, then you know about Hank Williams Sr. And you know what happened to him. He died in the back of a Cadillac due to a lethal combination of drugs and alcohol. That's the family tradition. Not a great family tradition, but it is the family tradition. And I think about how I read a book once, and it was called I think it was called something about poverty, understanding poverty, and in it talks about how poverty culture tends to beget more poverty culture down the line. And one of the very interesting things is that in poverty culture, people tend to not have the fear of going to jail that most of us have. And it makes a lot of sense, because if you live in some of the more poverty-stricken areas of the country, as I have in many times in my life, what you see is that people tend to go to jail because they steal to have. They try to get what they can, so they'll steal, they'll sell drugs, whatever it is. And so you end up having people who go to jail at high rates. So like when I was a youth pastor in a very poverty-stricken area, most of the kids that I had coming to my youth group were from the local trailer park. And as you listen, you just have to sit and listen to the kids for 30 minutes or so, and you'll find out whose dad's in jail, whose uncle's in jail, whose mom was in jail, and what you find out is these kids, they just think of jail as a rite of passage. It's what everyone does. I remember working at Lifeline and having some kids be absolutely shocked that I had never myself been to jail. And then not only that, but like almost none of my friends had been to jail. They were shocked by that because in their circles, it's a family tradition. It's what people do. It's what we hand down to people. And it's kind of a dim reflection of what we're going to call the Nezer family. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, it's the Ezer family. And it kind of is in a microcosm a little bit. Now, they took it to a whole other level, but it is kind of that way. They just hand down these bad traditions. And in verse 1, what we find is they prioritize personal advancement and self-aggrandizement just like Daddy Neb did. That's what Belshazzar does. He gives a great banquet with all these people, 1,000 of his nobles, and they're drinking wine together, and that's what we're doing. And we see this pattern throughout this book. In chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar, he conquered the world. And then in Daniel chapter 3, what do we see him doing? He's making an image of gold and calling all the power players together to honor him. And refusal is a fiery death. Because he believed that his kingdom was the kingdom. He listened to the hype about himself. This is a family that has stepped on, over, and through everyone in efforts to ascend the ladder of power and position. King Belshazzar actually is kind of a misnomer. We hear the word King Belshazzar, and I want you to know this is something that the biblical writers do quite a bit. Sometimes they'll skip generations. What we actually know from history is that King Belshazzar is not actually a king. In fact, he's not even actually Nebuchadnezzar's true heir. He's likely a grandson. He was never actually the king of Babylon. See, the actual lineage goes like this: Nebuchadnezzar, and then he had a son appropriately named Evil Marduk. The name actually means something else, but you know, Evil Marduk is actually a good name for him. He was pretty evil. And he took the throne for just a year. And then after that, there was Neriglissar, which is Neb's son-in-law. And he assassinated Evil Marduk. And he ruled until he died 6 years later. And then his son, Labashi Marduk, only ruled for a few months before he was, and I quote, liquidated. Which in their parlance meant he was beaten to death by his friends and family. Technically by his uncle and his friends. And so Nabonidus rose to power, and he was either Neb's son-in-law or he had married to his widow. That part we're not quite sure of. But Nabonidus is the actual king at this time. And he was super unpopular with the Babylonian priesthood due to his devotion to, and again, appropriately named, Sin, the moon god, which resulted in religious drift away from Marduk, which I think is kind of funny because here these people are accusing him of religious drift, theological drift, as he drifts from one false god to another false god. He was more or less exiled to an oasis in Arabia, and Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, ruled in Babylon, but he was only ever the crown prince. and it's believed to have led to a coup that cost his cousin his life, and it probably ousted his father. And that's why, interestingly enough, throughout this passage, you'll see about, I think, 3 times when Belshazzar says that the reward for being able to parse out all of this writing on the wall would be to be clothed in purple, have a gold chain, and you'll be the third in command. Not second in command, third in command. Why? Because third is as good as he can do. He's already the second in command. But the truth is, they prioritize the good life and good times just like Daddy Neb did. Just like Grandpa. This has not been going on for one generation. It has been going on for several generations. Through several branches of the family tree. This is a family tradition. And so Daniel in Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 1, he attempted to placate his new minions with the best food, the best wine, the good times. And then in chapter 4, what do we see here? Nebuchadnezzar's grandson doing the same thing. Belshazzar is wining and dining the best and brightest in his community. Belshazzar is just having this really big party at a really bad time. Because right now, the Medo-Persian army is waiting right outside his door. They have been conquering Babylon, and it was assembled right outside the city gates as he was drinking and debauching the night away. Did you ever think, when you read this passage, why were there 1,000 of the governors and of these important people from all over the kingdom? Why were they all in Babylon at this time, at the same time? It wasn't a convention. They were holding up. They were holding up. They were trying to stay away. So what did they decide to do? Well, let's eat and drink because tomorrow we die. They're refugees hiding from these advancing armies, and we might borrow the story from Nero. Say that Belshazzar is fiddling while Babylon is burning. And again, Grandpa Nebuchadnezzar was contented and confident in his power and his own prosperity until it came crashing down on him. And that is what happens to Belshazzar, because they're not learning their lessons. They didn't learn the lessons. They had this habit of disrespecting God just like Nebuchadnezzar did. 3 of the 4 preceding stories involve Nebuchadnezzar failing to recognize God's supremacy and his sovereignty, and it starts with him stealing God's things and stashing them in the temples of his gods to show superiority. That's how chapter 1 starts. He took all the things out of God's temple. He put them in his own temples to show my gods are better than the Israelite God. And so his grandson says, let's pull those things out and let's start drinking out of them. It's one thing to use items designed to bring glory to a holy God to do evil. Using them to honor other gods is beyond the pale. Contempt for the things of God often indicates contempt for God himself. And we live in a culture, and I hate to say this, but we live in a Christian culture that takes the things of God for granted at times. When I prayed this morning that sometimes we take for granted the ability to get up in the morning and read our scriptures. We take for granted the ability to come and gather together as a body of believers, and not just because we have the freedom that the world has never seen before to do so, but the fact is that God did not have to do what he did. And yet we take it for granted that we ought to be allowed. We take the things of God for granted. And then we treat them as though they're optional. Come to church when I feel like it, when I'm not too busy. I don't need to make it a priority. I just need to, it has to be there somewhere in my life, but I don't really feel like going every, week or even most weeks. I'll just come sometimes when I feel like it. Or I'll read my Bible when I feel like it, when I don't have something else to read. I'll give generously when I feel like it. And we take these things of God for granted, and we treat them with contempt. And the truth is, when we treat the things of God with contempt, we're treating him with contempt. And those who follow us are just as likely to repeat our mistakes as to learn from them. I would say sometimes more likely to repeat our mistakes than to learn from them. Every parent has said this, or at least you as a child have heard this: do as I say, not as I do. But that's rarely, if ever, how it actually works. The paths we follow and provide examples and implied permission for coming generations to do likewise, that's the path they follow. The lives we live will generally bring the greatest returns in the lives of our children and those with whom we have an influence. I'm not saying, and I'm not guaranteeing, that if you do right, that your children will always follow in your footsteps. That is never going to be a guarantee, because your children and your grandchildren have free will just like you did. However, what we know is that this is a general priority issue. That generally speaking, our children will follow in our footsteps. What we prioritize, they will prioritize. What we value, they will value. And we have no right to complain about the next generation pursuing other things with greater devotion and passion when we have expended greater amounts of time, energy, and money towards other things ourselves. And this is how the generation conflicts go, don't they? We sit back and we look at other generations coming up and we go, man, they value these things, and my generation, we value these things instead. But the truth is, if you look at your generation, you go, actually, did we really, or did we treat them as contemptuous things? Did we really value them, or did we only value them in word? Did we only value them insofar as we did them, but we didn't show the joy in it? We did it because it was a thing we have to do, not because we enjoyed doing it. What are your attitudes, your actions, and your patterns of living teaching those who are coming up behind you? If they pursue the priorities you are currently modeling for them, what are their lives going to look like in the years ahead? Where will God and the things of God fall in their lives if they follow your example? That is a question for each of us to ask ourselves. If my kids, if my grandkids, if my great-grandkids did what I do, believed what I believed, and took joy in what I take joy in, what will they pursue in the years to come? Will it be the things of Christ? Will it be the things of God? Or will it be something else? Don't treat God with indifference and then act astonished when you can't understand what he is doing. So here in verse 5 and 6 and 7, they see God working and they don't get it. This is where we get the phrase, we see the writing on the wall. He looks up and he sees this writing on the wall, and it's never a good thing. That's something that Belshazzar understands. I love how in this passage, Belshazzar, he has no idea what that hand is writing, but he knows that that's not a good sign. He is so frightened his knees are knocking. And in verse 6, actually, it says his face turned pale. He was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The literal translation there is, the knots of his loins were loosed. And if you know what the knots of your loins are, he lost control of his bladder and bowels. He messed himself. We have another term for that. I'm not going to say it, but there's another turn of phrase that he was scared. That's all I'm going to say. He was scared. And Proverbs 9 has a lot to say about that. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord is only of value, though, when it produces proper action in our lives. And in this case, it didn't. He just wanted to know what it said. And in another family tradition, they prioritized the advice of fools and forgot what God had said and done in the past. Again, it's only been a few years. And already Daniel has been shunted to the side. We don't care about his stuff anymore. We forgot about him at the highest levels because why would we have to worry about him? Let's just bring in those magicians and diviners who couldn't do my grandpa any good. Let's bring them in. And then it takes his wife to come in and say, hey, hold on. There is a guy who's been around for a while. Maybe you should ask him what he thinks. If I were to pick a theme for this story, it's the need to understand what God is doing and what he's saying. And the phrase, read the writing and tell what it means, appears a half a dozen times here. The search for insight, intelligence, and wisdom appears throughout this story as well. And is this not the great need of every age? When we look out at the world, it's easy to get overwhelmed with fear and frustration and everything, even if we can see and believe that God is working, even when we know it. It's hard to understand where, how, and why. And so there's no shortage of people who claim to have the ability, but too often they fail to come through when the time comes. It's a family tradition to follow fools when they have a person with wisdom and insight in their very midst. And the problem is sometimes we just put God on the sidelines, and then we complain that we can't find him when the time comes to be on the field of play. We put him on the sidelines. And once again, where's Daniel? And I think it is insane how easily they forgot him. And yet they go out there and they call him in, and Daniel comes through clutch. He's elevated to positions of greater influence throughout this story, but by the next story, he's been pushed to the side. It happens over and over and over. And my question is are we really better than them? It feels insane that they keep doing this. You read through the story of Daniel and you're like, why do they keep forgetting about him? Why does, Nebuchadnezzar already knows this guy can do what he needs him to do, and then the very next story he's calling for his magicians, calling for his diviners, and they can't do it again, and so he calls for Daniel again. Why do they keep forgetting about this guy? And it's easy for us to criticize. And I think, all too often, we're not better than them. We're really good at seeking God out, listening to his voice, and following his leading when the bottom falls out on us and when we're at the end of ourselves. But as soon as things get good, God goes back to the box. He goes back on the shelf, or he goes back onto the back burner, and we can go about our business. We can do whatever we want then. Like, I got it covered now. I got it covered. And then the bottom falls out, and we're looking for the answers everywhere and anywhere, and then we finally go back to the God shelf. We pull him off the shelf. Okay, God, you need your help with this. And then he helps us put our lives back together. It's okay, look back in the box. It's the same pattern over and over and over and over. And it feels insane to us when we look at it from the outside, but when we're doing it, it feels natural. It feels normal. And when things get bad again, we assume that it's God who failed us. And we wonder where he is and why he left us. Promise you, he did not leave you. He didn't fail you. You went off to do it on your own, and you're feeling the effects of that decision. He's still there, right where you left him, waiting for you to turn to him. And the good news is that the graciousness of God never fails to come through, because when you go and you look for him, he doesn't go, well, no, you didn't take my advice last time. He says, no, come to me. You can always come to me. It's not too late. And throughout the scriptures, we see it only takes a generation or two for people to forget what God had said and what he had done when they fail to make the effort to pass on what's been seen and heard to the next generation. And so the question is, does our love for the Lord outweigh our love of the world? And Daniel, I love the statement that Daniel makes here. He gets this offer, hey, if you can do this, I'll give you this, and this, and you'll be the third highest in the kingdom. And what does Daniel say to him? Did I say David? Daniel. Daniel says, keep your gifts. Give them to somebody else. Just correct your life. And some scholars read this as a thinly veiled insult in Belshazzar's address to Daniel. They think he knew of the interpretation of the dream of the statue, and he used the items of the temple of God of Daniel, and that was an intentional slight. I don't know if that's true or not. But I know that Daniel could understand it. And if Daniel could understand and explain the writing, he'd get this gold chain, this purple robe, all of those things. And Daniel refuses it. And by doing so, he removes any possibility that what he says is tainted or influenced, and that he's not beholden to Belshazzar. When he starts talking, that will be abundantly clear. Listen, Belshazzar, you don't own me. And I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. I'm going to tell you what that thing says, and it's not going to be what you want to hear. God's prophets have a long history of answering questions that people aren't asking, but they should be. They give the answer to the question behind the question. And so Daniel provides Belshazzar with a brief history lesson. He gives him the lesson, hey, you should have known all of this, and he doesn't hold back. Using the King James, he tells Belshazzar, God is able to turn the most powerful man in the world. And if you got a King James version, it doesn't say he turned him into a beast, turned him into an ass. And Belshazzar wasn't completely ignorant. He was insolent. He repeated his granddad's mistakes, but he didn't learn his lessons. And in answering the unasked question, Daniel provides the why behind the writing and then reveals the opportunity for repentance. Even as we face the consequences of our action, God continues to make his mercy available. And the question is, do we have the sense to pursue it then? There's meaning in the message and a warning for us. Mene, mene, tekel, parson. Counted and come up short. Hey, you have been counted, you've been weighed, and you're coming up light. And in those days, you don't come up light. If the books are being cooked, and if things aren't in the right order, and things aren't even, you're coming up short. You have to now pay. I remember being a cashier way back in the day. And back in the day, if you were a cashier and your drawer came up short, you were on the hook for it. God's telling him, your drawer is coming up short. And now it's your skin that has to pay for it. Tekel. It's interesting that the word mene appears twice. Sometimes people think it's a clerical error. I don't. I think it's intentional. Your drawer is short. Your drawer is short. A good accountant is going to check their math before they publish an audit. Like Santa Claus. I'm checking my list and I'm checking it twice. He did an audit of Belshazzar's heart, life, and found it wanting. And he's clear that what the king loved most was himself. And it's clear that he had no respect for the Lord. It's clear he had no fear of consequences. His response to Daniel is revealing. He gives Daniel the rewards that he had refused. And why does he do it? Because now he's thinking, I can pay my way out of this. I can bargain my way out. What good is being promoted third most powerful in the kingdom if that kingdom is going to fall in hours? Either he did not believe that the kingdom was really at risk, or he was trying to bargain with God. And we know that the Babylonian or the Persian Empire was right outside the city gates. There's no way he thought he was getting out of this. So he's just trying to bargain with God. Maybe a little extra coin and prestige for God's guy is going to tip the scales. But God's favor cannot be bought. It must be accepted by humble faith. And that is available to anyone as long as you live. What would God find if he did an audit of your life today? If God weighed you on the scales today, what would he find? Unlike my trips to the doctor, I fear that the content and quality of my life would come up more than a few pennies short of $1. There are times when I have that fear. I think that's why the Proverbs tell us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That fear should drive us to seek to be in God's grace, to seek to be reminded all the time that it is not my abilities, it is not my glory, it is not my work that has put me here. It is all about what God has done. That I am not important, that I am not the king of my life. I am not the ruler of my empire, nor is it my job to build an empire. All of us should be continuously auditing our own hearts and lives, looking for the areas where we've fallen short so that we can adjust our efforts and investments in keeping with God's word. We should remember that both the holiness and the mercy of our Lord. And the good news is that Jesus came to tip the scales in our favor. There's an old phrase called putting a thumb on the scales. It was a trick to make the scales come out in your favor. That's literally what Jesus did. He put his thumb on the scales of our lives. Because left to our own, we would all come up short. In fact, that is what Paul tells us. All have sinned, fall short of the glory of God. Every one of us falls short. We need somebody to tip the scales in our favor, to put their thumb on the scales so that we come up looking better than we actually are. And it is because of Christ that we do. And because of what he did, we don't live in fear of punishment, but we should be motivated by humble faith. We don't earn or acquire God's favor. We accept it and we live into it. And it's a priority that we should all pray that we and our children pursue and pass on in perpetuity. Because again, this story is a lesson that in that generationally, these things tend to degrade. It doesn't take much time at all to forget what God has done. It didn't take Nebuchadnezzar any time at all to forget what David had done. It didn't take Belshazzar any time at all to forget what God had done in his own grandfather's life. So how long is it going to take for our children or our grandchildren to forget what God has done if we don't teach them? To find importance in what we find important if we don't show them that it's important? How long will it take them to fall away? I would argue not long. So make this the day that you dedicate not only your life to Christ, but dedicate the lives that come behind you. Dedicate their lives. Do it for them as much as you do it for yourself, so that they will see the change in you, so that they will accept and understand and follow the things that you follow. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father in heaven, we come